The grandfather clock in the hall had ticked faithfully for 37 years, until the night she returned from the dead. I remember every detail with the clarity that only profound shock can bring. The bitter Yorkshire wind howled through the bare branches of the ancient oaks surrounding Bramwell Manor, rattling the Georgian windows like skeletal fingers demanding entry. October had been cruel that year, stripping the last warmth from the world and leaving behind only the promise of a harsh winter ahead. I am Lysander Bramwell, 29 years of age, and at that moment I was nothing more than a man drowning in his own guilt. 3 years had passed since I had withdrawn from London society, abandoning my promising career in law to manage our family estate in the remote Yorkshire dales. My father, once a respected magistrate, had died the previous spring, leaving me alone with servants who spoke in whispers and a house that seemed to echo with the weight of past decisions. The fire in the library was dying when I heard it, a sound that shouldn't have been possible. The great hall clock, which had never missed a single tick in all my years of memory, simply stopped. The silence that followed was so profound it made my ears ring. I set down my brandy and listened, every nerve suddenly alert. Then came the knock. 3 measured raps on the heavy oak door, each one deliberate and patient. My housekeeper, Mrs. Widmore, had retired hours ago, and no traveler in their right mind would venture out on such a night. The nearest village lay 5 miles through treacherous moors, and the road was barely passable even in fair weather. I approached the door with growing unease, my footsteps echoing in the vast entrance hall. Through the narrow window beside the door, I glimpsed a figure standing motionless in the driving rain. The person wore a long, dark cloak that seemed to absorb what little light escaped from our windows. But it was what I could see of the garment beneath that made my blood run cold. Rough hemp cloth, the unmistakable weave of a hangman's shroud. My hand trembled as I reached for the iron latch. Every rational thought screamed at me to leave the door barred, to retreat to my chamber and wait for dawn. But something deeper, a pull I couldn't name, compelled me forward. The latch lifted with a groan that seemed to come from the very bones of the house. She stood there in the threshold, water streaming from her cloak, her face hidden in shadow. For a moment, neither of us moved. The wind drove rain across the stone steps, and I could smell the earthy scent of the moors, mixed with something else, something that reminded me of churchyards and grief. "Good evening, Lysander." Her voice was soft, barely audible above the storm, yet it struck me like a physical blow. I knew that voice. I had heard it in my nightmares for 3 long years. "It cannot be," I whispered, my throat suddenly dry as parchment. "You're dead. I saw them. I saw them bury you." She reached up with pale, slender fingers and pushed back her hood. The candlelight from the hall fell across features I had never thought to see again in this world. Seraphina Ashcroft stood before me, exactly as she had been on that terrible day 3 years past, when her brother met his end on the village gallows, largely due to my testimony. Her dark hair was longer now, hanging in damp waves past her shoulders. Her green eyes, once bright with laughter, held depths I couldn't fathom. But it was unmistakably her, the woman whose family I had destroyed, whose brother I had failed to save, whose supposed death had haunted every waking moment since. "May I come in?" she asked, and there was something in her tone that was neither pleading nor demanding, but something in between, as if my answer would determine far more than whether she escaped the storm. I stepped back without conscious thought, my body moving independently of my paralyzed mind. She entered with fluid grace, her hemp garment rustling against the door frame. As she passed me, I caught another scent beneath the smell of rain and earth, lavender, just as I remembered. The contradiction between the funeral shroud and that familiar, living fragrance made my head spin. She moved into the great hall as if she belonged there, as if 3 years of supposed death were merely an inconvenient interruption. When she turned to face me again, pushing the wet cloak from her shoulders, I saw that she wore the simple brown dress of a common traveler, though the hemp rope belt around her waist was unmistakably the cord of the condemned. "You seem surprised to see me, Lysander." There was no mockery in her voice, no obvious anger, which somehow made her presence more unsettling than if she had arrived screaming accusations. "Did you never wonder what became of Thomas's sister after that day?" The mention of her brother's name hit me like a physical blow. Thomas Ashcroft, barely 21, guilty of nothing more than being in the wrong place, when the local magistrate needed someone to blame for the theft from Lord Pemberton's estate. I had been called as a witness, had seen Thomas near the property that night, and my testimony had sealed his fate. "I was told you had died of fever," I managed, my voice hoarse. "They said you couldn't bear the shame, that you took ill and died quietly, conveniently, troubling no one with inconvenient questions about my brother's innocence." She moved closer, and I noticed she left no wet footprints on the stone floor, though her cloak had been soaked through. How neat that must have been for everyone concerned. The implications of her words sent ice through my veins. If she lived, if she had been alive all this time, what did that mean about the story I had been told? What did it mean about the guilt that had driven me to this self-imposed exile? "Where have you been?" The question escaped me before I could stop it. Her smile was enigmatic, neither warm nor cold. "Learning things, Lysander. Learning about truth, about justice, about the price of silence." She began to untie the hemp cord from her waist, her movements deliberate and ceremonial. "Learning about the man whose words sent an innocent boy to swing from English oak." I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I had only spoken what I saw, that I had never intended for Thomas to die. But the words caught in my throat as she continued to speak, her voice never rising above that unsettling calm. "Do you know what these clothes mean?" She gestured to her rough garment. "They dressed him in hemp, just like this, before they put the noose around his neck. The tradition says that those who die unjustly can find no rest until the wrong is made right." My legs felt weak, and I grasped the back of a chair for support. "Serafina, if you're here for revenge, if you want to punish me for what happened, I understand. God knows I've punished myself every day since." "Have you?" Her interruption was sharp, the first real emotion I had heard in her voice. "Have you really, Lysander Bramwell? Living in your grand house, managing your vast estate, drinking fine brandy by warm fires, while my brother moulders in unhallowed ground?" The accusation stung because it carried uncomfortable truth. Yes, I had suffered, but I had suffered in comfort, surrounded by luxury, while the Ashcroft family had been destroyed. Her brother dead, herself apparently driven away by shame, and lost. What right did I have to claim equivalent pain? "Tell me," she continued, moving to stand before the dying fire, "in all your self-recrimination, did you ever once try to discover who really stole from Lord Pemberton? Did you ever question why Thomas was so conveniently available to take the blame?" I stared at her, my mouth dry. The honest answer was no. Once Thomas had been arrested and tried, once the matter had been closed with his execution, I had buried my doubts beneath layers of guilt and self-imposed isolation. I had accepted the official conclusion because questioning it would have required action, would have demanded I face uncomfortable truths about justice and my own role in its failure. But looking at Serafina now, alive when she should have been 3 years dead, wearing the garments of the condemned in defiance of all logic, I began to suspect that everything I thought I knew about that terrible night was about to crumble. She studied my face in the flickering candlelight, and I felt as though she could read every shameful thought that had ever crossed my mind. The silence stretched between us until it became almost unbearable, broken only by the wind howling through the eaves and the occasional crackle from the dying embers. "You never questioned it," she said finally, and it wasn't an accusation, but a statement of fact that cut deeper than any anger could have. "You testified that you saw my brother near Lord Pemberton's stables that night, and when they arrested him the next morning, you simply assumed justice would follow." I found my voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I saw what I saw, Serafina. Thomas was there, skulking in the shadows near the estate. When Lord Pemberton's prize stallion was found missing the next day, along with a considerable sum from his strongbox, the evidence seemed clear enough." Her laugh was hollow, devoid of any warmth. "Evidence?" "Yes, let's speak of evidence, shall we?" She moved away from the fire, pacing slowly around the great hall like a barrister preparing her case. "My brother, who could barely afford to feed himself, supposedly stole a thoroughbred horse worth more than most men see in a lifetime. Tell me, Lysander, where exactly did they find this stolen horse?" The question caught me off guard. I realized with growing discomfort that I had never actually inquired about the recovery of the stolen property. I assumed it had been found, or sold, or assumed. She stopped pacing and fixed me with those penetrating green eyes. "The horse was never found because it was never stolen." Lord Pemberton's precious stallion was exactly where it had always been, safe in his private stable on the far side of his estate. The money from his strongbox had been borrowed by his own son to cover gambling debts in London, though that convenient truth only came to light weeks after my brother was already buried. The words hit me like physical blows. I sank into the chair I had been gripping, my legs no longer able to support me. "That's impossible," the magistrate said. The evidence was conclusive. The evidence was a lie, carefully constructed by men who needed a scapegoat. Her voice remained steady, but I could see her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. Lord Pemberton's son had stolen from his father before, but this time the amount was too large to ignore. They needed someone to blame, someone expendable, someone whose word would carry no weight against that of landed gentry. I thought back to that night, forcing myself to remember details I had tried so hard to forget. Thomas had indeed been near the Pemberton estate, but now that I recalled it clearly, he had been walking openly along the public road, not lurking in shadows, as I had somehow convinced myself. He had even nodded to me in greeting when our paths crossed. "But why?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. "Why would they choose Thomas specifically?" Seraphina's expression softened for the first time since her arrival, and I glimpsed the young woman I had once known, before tragedy had marked her so deeply. "Because he had been asking questions about his father's death. Our father died in what was ruled an accident 3 years before Thomas's execution, a fall from his horse while riding alone. But Thomas had discovered evidence that the horse had been deliberately spooked, that someone had wanted our father silenced." She moved to the window, gazing out at the storm-lashed moors. "Our father was the village blacksmith, but he was also something more dangerous to certain people. He was honest. He had discovered that Lord Pemberton's overseer was systematically cheating the tenant farmers, taking more than the agreed portion of their harvests, and pocketing the difference. When he threatened to expose the scheme, he had to be eliminated. The pieces of a horrible puzzle began falling into place in my mind. And when Thomas inherited his father's suspicions, he became a liability as well. When the opportunity arose to eliminate him under the guise of justice for theft, they seized it gladly." She turned back to me, and I was shocked to see tears glittering in her eyes. "My brother died because he wanted justice for our father's murder, and because men like Lord Pemberton and his cronies couldn't allow their corruption to be exposed." I buried my face in my hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was telling me. An innocent man had died because of my testimony, but worse than that, he had died as part of a conspiracy to protect the truly guilty. I had been not just a witness, but an unwitting accomplice in judicial murder. "Why didn't you speak up?" I asked desperately. "If you knew the truth, why didn't you come forward during the trial?" Her laugh was bitter now, tinged with old pain. "I tried. I went to the magistrate, to the constable, even to Lord Pemberton himself. Do you know what they told me? That I was a grieving sister, driven mad by loss, seeing conspiracies where none existed. A woman's word against that of a respected gentleman, what chance did I have?" The fire had died to mere embers now, casting the hall in deeper shadow. In the dim light, Seraphina seemed almost ethereal, like a spirit conjured from my guilty conscience. But her presence was undeniably real, as was the terrible truth she had brought with her. "So you let them believe you had died?" I said, understanding beginning to dawn. It seemed the safest course. There had been threats, anonymous warnings that if I continued to make trouble, I might suffer an unfortunate accident like my father. So I arranged for word to spread that I had taken ill and died, and I left Yorkshire under cover of darkness. "Where did you go?" I found myself leaning forward, genuinely curious about this woman who had endured so much loss and injustice. "London first, then Scotland, finally Ireland. I found work where I could, save what money I was able, and most importantly I learned. I discovered that the corruption in our little corner of Yorkshire was part of a much larger network. Lord Pemberton and men like him have been systematically cheating and stealing from those too poor or powerless to fight back." She moved closer to my chair, and I caught again that scent of lavender that seemed so at odds with her grim attire. "But I also learned something else, Lysander. I learned that not everyone involved in Thomas's death was equally guilty. Some were architects of the conspiracy, while others were merely tools, manipulated into serving ends they never understood. Our eyes met, and I saw something in her gaze that I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the possibility of it. You think I was manipulated. I know you were. The night you saw Thomas on the road, you weren't there by chance. You had received a message, hadn't you? Someone had suggested you take that particular route home from the village inn. My blood ran cold as the memory surfaced. Yes, there had been a message, a casual suggestion from Lord Pemberton's overseer that I might want to avoid the main road that evening due to reports of footpads. The alternate route had taken me directly past the spot where Thomas was walking. They wanted a witness, I whispered, the full scope of the manipulation becoming clear. Someone respectable, someone whose word would be believed without question. The son of the former magistrate, a promising young lawyer himself. Yes, you were the perfect witness. Honest, reliable, and completely unaware that you were being used to provide the final piece of evidence needed to frame an innocent man. I stood abruptly, pacing to the window as the weight of revelation crashed over me. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. Lightning flickered across the moors, illuminating the landscape in stark black and white, much like the moral clarity that was finally emerging from years of confusion and guilt. "What do you want from me, Seraphina?" I asked, my voice rough with emotion. "I can't bring Thomas back. I can't undo the testimony that helped condemn him. If you're here for vengeance, I won't resist it. God knows I deserve whatever punishment you think fit." When I turned back to face her, she was standing very close, close enough that I could see the gold flecks in her green eyes, the way her dark hair curled slightly from the dampness. Close enough to notice that beneath the harsh hemp of her symbolic garment, she was still achingly and possibly alive. "Vengeance is for the truly guilty," she said softly. "What I want from you, Lysander Bramwell, is something far more difficult and dangerous than your death." She paused, letting the words hang in the air between us like a challenge. Have you ever felt your entire world shift on its axis in the space of a heartbeat? That's what I experienced in that moment, waiting for her to continue, knowing that whatever she said next would change everything. "I want justice," she said, her voice carrying a conviction that seemed to fill the entire hall. "Not the mockery of justice that killed my brother, but real justice. I want the truth exposed, the guilty punished, and the innocent vindicated, even if it comes 3 years too late to save Thomas." I stared at her, my mind reeling. "Seraphina, these are powerful men we're discussing. Lord Pemberton has connections throughout Yorkshire, possibly beyond. His overseer, the magistrate who presided over Thomas's trial, the constables who arrested him, they're all part of a system that protects its own." "Yes," she agreed, beginning to untie the hemp cord from around her waist with deliberate movements. "Which is exactly why I need someone on the inside, someone with the right name, the right connections, the right social standing to be heard when he speaks." The implication of her words struck me like lightning. "You want me to investigate, to gather evidence against them." She let the rough cord fall to the floor, and I noticed that beneath the symbolic shroud, her dress was well made, though simple. This was not the garb of a woman who had spent 3 years in destitute exile, but rather someone who had been carefully preparing for this moment. "I want more than investigation, Lysander. I want you to help me destroy them, completely and utterly. But first, I need to know if you have the courage for what that will require." Thunder crashed overhead, so loud it seemed the very wall shook. In the brief silence that followed, I could hear my own heart pounding. Everything in my rational mind screamed that this was madness, that challenging such entrenched corruption would mean my ruin, possibly my death. But looking at this extraordinary woman, who had returned from the supposed grave to seek justice for her murdered family, I felt something stirring in my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. For 3 years, I had wallowed in guilt and self-pity, accomplishing nothing except my own misery. Here was a chance to actually do something meaningful, something that might honor the memory of the innocent man whose death I had inadvertently helped cause. "What did you have in mind?" I asked, and I saw something kindle in her eyes that might have been hope. She moved to the leather satchel she had left by the door, returning with a thick bundle of papers and documents. "I haven't been idle during my exile. I've traced the network of corruption that extends far beyond our little corner of Yorkshire. Lord Pemberton's overseer, Marcus Grimley, has been running similar schemes on at least a dozen estates across northern England. Tenant farmers cheated, local officials bribed, anyone who threatens to expose the truth eliminated. She spread the documents across the hall table, and I saw ledgers, correspondence, carefully copied records that painted a picture of systematic theft on a massive scale. "My God!" I breathed, scanning the evidence. "This represents thousands of pounds stolen from people who could least afford it." "Tens of thousands," she corrected. "And the network includes judges, magistrates, even members of parliament." Thomas stumbled into something much larger than a simple case of local corruption. I studied her face in the candlelight, noting the determined set of her jaw, the way her hands remained perfectly steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "How did you gather all this?" "Some of these documents, they would have been closely guarded." A small, enigmatic smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I told you I learned things during my exile. Skills I never imagined I would need. There are people in London, Edinburgh, Dublin, people who have also suffered at the hands of men like Lord Pemberton. People willing to help others seek justice when the official channels fail." The implications of what she was saying were staggering. This wasn't just about clearing Thomas's name or exposing local corruption. This was about dismantling an entire criminal enterprise that had destroyed countless lives across the country. "But why me?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I knew the answer. "Surely others would be better positioned to act on this information." "Because you have something the others lack," she said, moving closer until I could see the gold flecks in her green eyes clearly. "You have legitimate access to legal channels, social connections that could prove crucial, and most importantly, you have a personal stake in seeing justice done. Your testimony helped condemn an innocent man. Now your testimony could help bring down the truly guilty." She was right, of course. As the son of a former magistrate, as someone with legal training and social standing, I could pursue avenues of investigation and prosecution that would be closed to others. More than that, I owed it to Thomas's memory to use whatever advantages I possessed in service of the truth. But there was something else in her manner, something that suggested this wasn't merely about justice or revenge. When she stood this close, when I saw the way the candlelight played across her features, I was reminded of the young woman I had known before tragedy struck her family. She had been beautiful then, full of life and laughter. Now she was something more complex, still beautiful, but marked by suffering in ways that made her seem both fragile and incredibly strong. "There's something you're not telling me," I said, studying her carefully. "This plan of yours, it's more dangerous than you're letting on, isn't it?" Her smile faded, and for the first time since her arrival, I saw genuine fear flicker across her expression. "Extremely dangerous. These men have killed to protect their secrets before my father, and they would have killed Thomas even without the convenient excuse of the theft charges. If we move against them, they won't hesitate to eliminate both of us." The admission should have terrified me, but instead I felt oddly calm. Perhaps it was the brandy, or the surreal nature of the entire evening, but I found myself nodding. "Then we'll have to be very careful, won't we?" Relief flooded her features, and she reached out impulsively, grasping my hands in hers. Her fingers were surprisingly warm, and I could feel calluses that spoke of hard work during her years away. "You'll do it? You'll help me?" "I'll do more than help," I said, surprised by the conviction in my own voice. "I'll partner with you. We'll see this through together, whatever the cost." The transformation that came over her face was remarkable. The carefully controlled mask she had worn since her arrival slipped away, revealing glimpses of the passionate, determined woman beneath. For just a moment, she looked almost young again, despite everything she had endured. "Thank you," she whispered, and I heard years of loneliness and pain in those two simple words. "I wasn't certain you would agree. After all, I'm asking you to risk everything you have for the sake of people you've never met." "Not just for them," I replied, still holding her hands, acutely aware of how right they felt in mine. "For Thomas. For your father. For you. And perhaps for myself as well. I've been half dead these past 3 years, drowning in guilt and isolation. You're offering me a chance to actually live again, to do something that matters." She searched my face as if trying to read my sincerity, and whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. "It won't be easy. We'll need to be absolutely careful about who we trust, how we gather additional evidence, how we approach the authorities. One wrong move, and we'll both end up like my brother. Then we better make sure we don't make any wrong moves, I said, feeling more alive than I had in years. The prospect of danger, of purpose, of working alongside this remarkable woman to right a terrible wrong, it was intoxicating in a way that had nothing to do with the brandy I consumed earlier. She released my hands and began gathering the documents from the table. We should start tomorrow. There's a tenant farmer named William Hardwell, who lives about 10 miles north of here. His family was cheated out of their entire harvest last season by Grimley's scheme. If we can convince him to testify to what happened, it might give us the opening we need to begin building a case. I watched her efficient movements, the way she handled the precious documents with such care. Where will you stay tonight? You can't travel in this storm, and I doubt the village inn would be safe if anyone recognizes you. She paused in her packing, and I saw uncertainty cross her features for the first time. I hadn't really considered. I suppose I could find shelter somewhere on the moors, wait for the storm to pass. Absolutely not, I said firmly. You'll stay here. Mrs. Whitmore can prepare the blue guest chamber. It's at the far end of the house, private and comfortable. In the morning, we can begin planning our campaign properly. The look she gave me was unreadable, a mixture of gratitude and something else I couldn't quite identify. Are you certain? If anyone were to discover that I'm alive, staying in your house, let them discover it, I replied with more courage than I felt. I'm tired of living in fear, tired of letting other men dictate the terms of my existence. If we're going to bring justice to those who destroyed your family, we might as well start by refusing to be intimidated by their shadow. For the second time that evening, she smiled, not the bitter, pained expression I had seen before, but something genuine and warm that transformed her entire face. In that moment, I realized that whatever happened in the days and weeks ahead, my life had irrevocably changed. There would be no going back to the quiet desperation of my self-imposed exile. The storm outside was beginning to subside, and I noticed she was listening to the changing tempo of the wind with the attention of someone accustomed to reading weather signs. Would you believe me if I told you that despite everything, the danger, the uncertainty, the likelihood that we were both walking toward our own destruction, I felt happier in that moment than I had in 3 years? Sometimes it takes the prospect of losing everything to make you realize you never truly had anything worth keeping. The next morning brought a transformation as dramatic as the storm's passing. Pale autumn sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the breakfast room as I waited for Serafina to join me, my mind already racing with plans and possibilities. Mrs. Whitmore had prepared the guest chamber without question, though I caught her curious glances when I explained that we had an unexpected visitor who would be staying indefinitely. When Serafina appeared in the doorway, I barely recognized her. Gone was the grim hemp shroud of the previous evening, replaced by a traveling dress of deep blue wool that complemented her eyes perfectly. Her dark hair was arranged simply but elegantly, and she moved with the confident grace of a woman comfortable in refined surroundings. It struck me then that I had never really known who she was before tragedy marked her family. I had seen her only briefly in the village, always in her brother's shadow. "Good morning," she said, accepting the chair I pulled out for her with a small smile. I hope Mrs. Whitmore wasn't too shocked by my sudden appearance. She's the soul of discretion, I assured her, pouring coffee into her cup. Though I suspect she's burning with curiosity about your identity and the circumstances of your arrival. As we shared breakfast, I found myself studying her face in the clear morning light. The grief lines were still there, etched around her eyes and mouth, but there was something else as well, a vitality that hadn't been apparent the night before. Whatever her years of exile had cost her, they had also forged her into someone formidable. I've been thinking about our approach, I said, spreading butter on fresh bread. If we're going to build a case that will stand up in court, we need more than testimony from cheated farmers. We need documentary evidence, financial records, correspondence that proves the conspiracy. She nodded approvingly. I agree completely. That's why I think we should start with Marcus Grimley himself. He's the keystone of the entire operation. Remove him, and the whole structure might collapse. Grimley keeps his records at his house in the village, doesn't he? I asked, remembering the overseer's modest but well-appointed residence near the church. He does, but getting access to them won't be simple. The man is naturally suspicious, and after what happened with Thomas, he's even more paranoid about potential threats. She paused, considering. However, there might be another way. I leaned forward, intrigued. What do you have in mind? Her smile was enigmatic, and I caught a glimpse of the sharp intelligence that had enabled her to gather such extensive evidence during her supposed death. Grimley has a weakness. He's been carrying on an affair with the innkeeper's wife for the past 2 years. Every Thursday evening, when her husband travels to the market in Leeds, Grimley visits her. During those visits, his house stands empty except for a single servant. The implications were clear, though the risks were enormous. You're suggesting we break into his house. I'm suggesting we recover stolen property, she corrected with a slight smile. Those records document crimes against dozens of innocent families. Morally, if not legally, they belong to the victims of his schemes. I set down my coffee cup, my mind racing through the logistics. It could work. Thursday evenings, you said? That gives us 2 days to prepare. But Serafina, if we're caught, we won't be caught, she said with quiet confidence. I've learned to be very careful about such things. There was something in her tone that made me wonder exactly what other skills she had acquired during her years away, but I didn't press the matter. Instead, I found myself admiring her courage, her willingness to risk everything for the sake of justice. Very well, I decided. Thursday evening it is. But we'll need to be absolutely certain of our intelligence timing, personnel, security measures. She reached across the table and touched my hand briefly, and I felt that same electric thrill I had experienced the night before. Leave that to me. I've been watching Grimley's patterns for weeks, learning his routines. Trust me, Lysander, I know exactly what we're getting into. The touch of her fingers lingered even after she withdrew her hand, and I realized that somewhere between her dramatic arrival and this moment of quiet conspiracy, my feelings toward her had begun to shift in ways I hadn't anticipated. She was no longer just the sister of a man whose death I felt responsible for, no longer just a partner in seeking justice. She was becoming something far more complicated and dangerous to my peace of mind. We spent the rest of the morning planning, poring over maps of the village and discussing contingencies. Her knowledge was impressive. She knew not only Grimley's habits, but those of his neighbors, the constable's patrol routes, even which dogs were likely to bark at strangers. The depth of her preparation suggested this wasn't an impulsive decision, but something she had been working toward for months. Around midday, a commotion in the courtyard drew our attention to the window. An elegant carriage was approaching. Bearing the coat of arms, I recognized with a chill of apprehension Lord Pemberton himself was paying me an unexpected visit. Quickly, I said to Serafina, you need to get upstairs. If he sees you. But she was already moving, gathering her papers with practiced efficiency. The back stairs, she said quietly. I'll watch from the upper landing. I want to hear what he has to say. Lord Pemberton entered my hall with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to being welcomed everywhere. He was in his 50s, well-dressed and imposing, with the kind of presence that commanded respect through sheer assumption of superiority. I had known him peripherally for years, but this was the first time he had visited Bramwell Manor since my father's death. Lysander, my boy, he said, extending his hand with false warmth. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I was passing by and thought it time we had a proper conversation. I accepted his handshake, noting the calculating look in his pale blue eyes. Of course, my lord. Please, come into the drawing room. Can I offer you refreshment? As we settled into chairs by the fireplace, I studied his face, looking for signs of the corruption and cruelty Serafina had described. He seemed perfectly ordinary, a successful landowner going slightly to fat, with the confidence that came from generations of privilege. It was difficult to reconcile this mundane figure with the architect of murder and theft. I'll be direct with you, Lysander, he said, accepting a glass of wine. There have been some disturbing rumors circulating in the village. Talk of strangers asking questions about old cases, about the Ashcroft matter specifically. My blood turned to ice, but I kept my expression carefully neutral. Oh, I hadn't heard any such rumors. His smile was thin and calculating. Come now, we both know that isolated as you become, you're hardly plugged into village gossip. But the point is, someone has been stirring up old grievances, suggesting that perhaps justice wasn't properly served in the Ashcroft case. I forced myself to meet his gaze steadily. The case was thoroughly investigated and tried. Thomas Ashcroft was found guilty by a jury of his peers. Indeed he was. Lord Pemberton agreed, but there was something cold in his tone. And it would be a tragedy if misguided sentiment were to cast doubt on that verdict now. The reputation of our entire system of justice depends on public confidence in its decisions. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. He was warning me away from exactly the path Serafina and I had chosen to pursue. The question was whether his visit was coincidental or whether he somehow suspected my involvement in these mysterious inquiries. I can't imagine anyone would want to revisit such an unpleasant matter, I said carefully. No, indeed. He set down his wine glass and leaned forward slightly. Which is why I thought it important to mention that if you should happen to hear any such disturbing rumors, you might want to discourage them. For the sake of community harmony, you understand. I nodded noncommittally, my mind racing. How much did he know? Was this a general warning prompted by unrelated concerns? Or had he somehow learned of Serafina's return? There's something else, he continued, his tone becoming more pointed. My overseer, Marcus Grimley, mentioned that he's seen lights in your windows at unusual hours, noticed increased activity around the estate. Nothing concerning, I'm sure, but in these times of uncertainty, it pays to be vigilant about suspicious behavior. The message was clear they were watching me, had perhaps been watching for some time. Any move Serafina and I made would have to be executed with extraordinary care. I appreciate your concern, I replied evenly. I've been working late recently, going through my father's papers, settling estate business that has been too long neglected. Admirable, he said, rising to his feet. Your father was a good man, a pillar of the community. I'm sure he would want his son to continue in that tradition, supporting the established order, maintaining stability, avoiding any unfortunate entanglements. As I escorted him to his carriage, he placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. You know, Lysander, you've been rather reclusive since your return from London. Perhaps it's time you rejoined society properly. There are certain responsibilities that come with your position, certain expectations. I do hope you won't disappoint those who have your best interests at heart. I watched his carriage disappear down the drive, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anger. The man had just threatened me in my own home, made it clear that he would be monitoring my activities, all while maintaining the facade of neighborly concern. When I returned to the house, I found Serafina waiting in the hall, her face pale but determined. You heard? I asked. Every word. He knows something, Lysander. Perhaps not everything, but enough to be worried. She moved closer, and I saw that her hands were trembling slightly. We're running out of time. If we're going to act, it has to be soon. I reached out and took her hands in mine, steadying their tremor. Then Thursday night it is. No more delays, no more hesitation. She looked up at me, and in her eyes I saw not just determination, but something else, trust, perhaps even affection. The realization that she was placing her life in my hands, just as I was placing mine in hers, created a bond between us that went far deeper than mere partnership in a dangerous enterprise. Together, she said softly, and the words seemed to carry meanings far beyond our immediate plans. Together, I agreed, and knew that whatever happened in the days ahead, I would never be the same man who had lived in guilty isolation for 3 long years. Thursday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the late October weather was conspiring to aid our desperate mission. We had spent the intervening days in careful preparation, studying the layout of Grimley's house, timing the movements of his lone servant, and rehearsing our planned approach until every detail was committed to memory. As darkness fell, Serafina and I made our way through the village by separate routes, she moving through the shadowed alleyways like a ghost while I took the more direct path past the inn where Grimley was undoubtedly occupied with his weekly assignation. The irony wasn't lost on me that his moral corruption would provide the cover for exposing his financial crimes. The overseer's house stood dark and silent, exactly as Serafina had predicted. A single candle flickered in an upper window where the servant kept his vigil, but the ground floor was shrouded in darkness. We met in the small garden behind the house, and I was struck by how completely at ease she seemed in these criminal circumstances. The study window, she whispered, producing a set of tools I preferred not to examine too closely. Grimley never locks it properly. He believes his reputation is sufficient protection. Within minutes, we were inside, moving carefully through rooms I had never seen before. Grimley's taste ran to ostentation, expensive furniture that seemed designed more to impress than comfort, paintings that spoke of wealth rather than refinement. It occurred to me that a simple overseer should not have been able to afford such luxury on his legitimate wages. The study proved to be a treasure trove beyond our wildest expectations. Grimley had been meticulous in his record-keeping, perhaps too confident in his security to worry about destroying evidence. Ledgers detailed systematic theft from tenant farmers across a dozen estates. Correspondence revealed a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of local government, and most damning of all, we found records of payments to various officials for their cooperation in covering up the crimes. "Look at this," Serafina breathed, holding up a letter bearing Lord Pemberton's seal. "Instructions to Grimley about silencing my father, dated just 3 days before his supposed accident." My hand shook as I read the casual way murder was discussed, as if the death of an honest blacksmith was merely a business expense. Another document detailed the plan to frame Thomas, complete with contingencies for ensuring his conviction regardless of the actual evidence. But it was the final discovery that left us both speechless. Hidden behind a false panel in Grimley's desk, we found a contract bearing multiple signatures: Lord Pemberton, the magistrate who had tried Thomas, the constable who had arrested him, and several others I recognized as prominent local figures. The document outlined their criminal partnership with mathematical precision, detailing how profits would be divided and risks shared. "This is it," I whispered, carefully folding the incriminating papers. "This is enough to destroy them all." We had been in the house for less than an hour, but it felt like a lifetime. As we prepared to leave, Serafina suddenly grasped my arm, her eyes wide with alarm. Through the front window, we could see torchlight approaching, multiple figures moving with obvious purpose toward the house. "Someone's betrayed us," she hissed, and I saw genuine fear in her expression for the first time since her return. There was no time to analyze how our mission had been discovered. We gathered the most damning documents and fled through the rear window just as heavy footsteps began pounding on the front door. Behind us, I could hear Grimley's voice raised in fury, demanding to know who had dared violate his sanctuary. We ran through the dark streets like fugitives, which I suppose we were, clutching evidence that could topple the entire corrupt structure that had ruled our corner of Yorkshire for years. By the time we reached Bramwell Manor, both of us were breathing hard, exhilarated by our narrow escape and the magnitude of what we had discovered. "We did it," Serafina said, laughing with a mixture of relief and triumph as we spread the documents across my library table. "We actually did it." Looking at her in the candlelight, her cheeks flushed with excitement, her eyes bright with victory, I felt something shift decisively in my chest. This wasn't just partnership anymore, wasn't just shared purpose in seeking justice. Somewhere between her mysterious arrival and this moment of triumph, I had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with her. The realization should have terrified me, but instead it felt like coming home after a long journey through foreign territory. Everything that had happened, Thomas's death, my years of guilt and isolation, even tonight's dangerous mission had been leading to this moment of clarity. "Serafina," I began, but she turned toward me then, and whatever she saw in my expression made her own face soften in a way I had never seen before. "I know," she said quietly, moving closer until I could see the gold flecks in her green eyes clearly. "I feel it too, Lysander. I've been trying not to, trying to focus only on justice for my family, but I can't deny it any longer. When I kissed her, it was with 3 years of loneliness and guilt finally lifting from my shoulders." She responded with a passion that spoke of her own long exile, her own desperate need for connection and hope. In that moment, the corrupt officials and their schemes seemed far less important than the warmth of her lips, the way she fit perfectly in my arms. We broke apart reluctantly, and I saw tears glittering in her eyes. "I never thought," she whispered, "after everything that's happened, after all the hatred and pain, that I could feel this way again. That I could trust someone enough to..." "To what?" I asked gently, stroking her cheek. "To love them," she finished, and the words hit me like a physical force. The next morning brought a resolution more dramatic than either of us had dared hope. Armed with Grimley's documents, I rode to Leeds and presented our evidence to the regional magistrate, a man whose reputation for incorruptibility was legendary. Within hours, warrants were issued for the arrest of Lord Pemberton, Marcus Grimley, and a dozen other conspirators. The trials that followed created a sensation throughout Yorkshire and beyond. The exposure of such systematic corruption sent shockwaves through the establishment, leading to reforms that would protect future generations of tenant farmers and laborers. Thomas Ashcroft was posthumously exonerated, his name cleared of all charges, though that vindication came too late to ease the pain of his loss. But perhaps the most significant outcome was personal. As the truth emerged and justice was finally served, Serafina and I found ourselves free to build a life together unburdened by the guilt and grief that had defined our past. We were married the following spring in the same church where Thomas had once been condemned, symbolically transforming a place of sorrow into one of hope and new beginnings. Standing at the altar with her hand in mine, I reflected on the strange path that had brought us together. Her brother's death had been a tragedy that nearly destroyed us both, but from that darkness had emerged something precious and strong. We had learned that love could indeed transcend the deepest grief, that justice delayed was not always justice denied, and that sometimes the most profound connections are forged in the crucible of shared purpose and mutual trust. The years that followed were marked by happiness I had never imagined possible. Serafina proved to be not only a devoted wife, but also a passionate advocate for social reform, using her experience and intelligence to help others who suffered under corrupt systems. Together, we worked to ensure that what had happened to her family could never happen to others. Children came in due time, and we named our first son Thomas, ensuring that her brother's memory would live on in joy rather than sorrow. Our daughter bore my mother's name, creating connections between past and future that healed old wounds and celebrated new possibilities. On quiet evenings, when the fire burned low in our drawing room and our children slept peacefully upstairs, Serafina and I would sometimes speak of that night when she had appeared at my door wearing the garb of the hanged. We marveled at the courage that had brought her back from supposed death, at the chain of events that had transformed enemies into lovers, grief into purpose, isolation into partnership. The clock in our hall, a newer timepiece that had replaced the one that stopped on the night of her return, ticked steadily through the hours of our contentment. Unlike that fateful midnight, when time seemed suspended between despair and hope, our days now flowed with the natural rhythm of a life well lived, filled with love, purpose, and the deep satisfaction that comes from having fought for justice and won. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the darkest moments, when loss threatens to consume everything we hold dear. But if we have the courage to trust, to hope, to believe that redemption is possible even when all seems lost, we might discover that every heart truly does deserve a second chance to love. The clock stopped at midnight when she knocked wearing the garb of the hanged, but in that moment of seeming ending, our real story was just beginning. If you've enjoyed this tale of love conquering injustice, and second chances triumphing over despair, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more stories of historical romance that prove love can overcome even the darkest circumstances, make sure to subscribe to this channel for new tales of passion, justice, and redemption from centuries past.